Is that permanently or is it, I didn't read it because I didn't have my right glasses.
Oh, you need to sit up now.
Is he moving?
I think it's just for Tom.
Technical stuff
Mhm.
that I never thought in a million years I would be doing.
It was a new world.
I know.
Adapt or die.
Let me know when that's.
You go ahead.
Is that's not permanent? Is it?
Oh.
Oh, thank gosh.
And I also sent you an email this morning.
Yeah. But.
Yes.
Yeah, got that.
Yo es lo que voy a hacer hoy. Hoy voy a hablar con los de
Ajá.
gente que no tiene es muy capaz y no después lo puede hacer. Entonces, si no, o sea, si no puedo leer los documentos bien, no lo quieres hacer bien, ¿no?
Tiempo.
Sí.
Your full email is a must for you, Teresa.
Emails, FYI journal from our people.
No,
Just general.
malfunctions. Shouldn't be happening.
En vez de correos como participar en suscripciones y
You
así.
need to plug in.
Yeah, I should, just better safe than sorry.
No, así como remites.
When over there, I mean, I need an
Yeah.
extension for.
Pero las de trabajo y así sí.
tienes.
Las tengo porque si no me da
Sí.
como.
Tú eres ese tipo, ya me imaginaba.
Right.
Ay, güey, yo no sé qué tipo es, pero sí.
Y aparte
Te
tengo
puedes
como.
confiar que yo tengo miles de. Tengo una amiga que cada vez que ve mi teléfono me dice, ¿cómo es posible que tengas 59 textos sin responder? Yo como, pues la mitad son cosas políticas como enough eyes, no sé qué, friendly reminder, like an appointment. No lo sabe y es como, los bórralos.
Sí, yo
Siempre me dice como, ¿cómo
mi
puedes seguir
hermano,
así?
mi hermano es así, mi hermano tiene en su iPhone, sale, o sea, tiene como los iconos así agrupados como yo, pero él tiene, no sé, su correo normal, igual 2500 correos sin abrir, y le sale el numerito.
¡Qué violencia!
Y yo, yo me quedo, digo, ¿cómo vives? O sea.
A mí no me molesta.
Mañana New York, ¡ay, chispas! Alguien se cayó. Sí, ok.
Ya, they're okay. Hola.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
¿Cómo estás tú? Bien, viendo a la gente cayéndose ahí.
Sí, hay que ir con mucho cuidado.
No, se cayó. Estamos resbalosos. Yo también, y luego traté de venir a las 12, todo mal. Primero se me olvidó, luego me acordé, bueno, porque Alejandro me dijo que había cosa hoy, y luego a las 12.
Sí, me ya.
So when you're
Yeah.
anyone?
Sí, hay comida, ¿verdad?
Okay, so our live stream is now.
Or
So
watch my language then.
you are. Not good. I trust brush. Had Pete Buttigieg here last week and
Yeah, oops, sorry.
Pete Buttigieg
Yeah.
and we were going from one point to the other and I said, "Is that right there, Mike?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay." Because he had a camera crew following him with us. That's perfect. Will you need your laptop up there?
I'll figure it up there, yeah.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a hack located.
Nice.
So we will ship it.
Yeah, I was just.
You know what that.
There we go. Okay. There we go.
No, I can't really say.
I'm sorry. Just for once.
Actually, I think it's easy conversation. No sé si la seguimos
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to do a little slide advance, make sure that you've got,
Hopefully, not working.
there we go, see.
We met 2 years ago, in Colorado. We visited, I believe. Colorado. See you. Or not? Never visited. So, who are you?
Chris Anderson. I used to be at City Boulder, now I'm here. Maybe at APSA or Midwest, maybe. Anyway,
You're here now.
fan of work, yes.
Well, thanks. I mean, good to see you again, maybe.
Yeah, except.
I'm embarrassed to say this happens so frequently.
Oh, yeah.
I spend so much time learning students' names and then I forget them and I see them 5 years later and I'm like.
Yeah.
What happened?
We're gonna have to like call similar, after this Javier.
You look familiar, but it must be more recently than this.
Probably, I think, a couple of years in the BSP at Oxford.
Hi, what's your last name?
Javier Perez Sandoval.
Oxford, yeah. Probably. Did we have like coffee like outside of
Yes.
Tim's college? Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
Where he came by in his robes.
I think so.
Yeah. It's long Tim, you know.
Yeah.
Walks in, you know.
Yes, yeah, probably that's.
Let's just make sure this is working. Okay, it's all working.
Yes.
All right. I gotta.
It looks
get
good
myself
from
organized.
my side, David.
Okay, and now it's working, so we're all good. Okay.
Hey, so that's why you.
Yeah, it's for
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the state. And the committee should work, yeah.
So you're not
I-
going to vote.
Well, I am traveling every Friday. Yeah. And it's the April 1, I should be here. First one. Coming up. And.
Okay.
Yes, we do want vote.
So.
Hello.
Meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I was gonna see you.
Okay.
Bueno, me imagino que sí, pero Leo está en chica, no, sí, está mucho el fresco, tampoco está, entonces ya son grandes, entonces ya están acostumbrados.
Mira, Juan Víctor, no entró en nada.
Bueno, que no lo conozco. Una sinagógica.
Buenos días.
El programa.
Es bastante estoy completo, la verdad. I've been working on it. BBC, pero es en español, que es política, Politics, Philosophy and Communication. En Madrid. Mira, yo creo que esta manera, yo creo que ustedes no vas. Tienes que comer. Padrísimo. Creo que es una experiencia. Y él tiene universidad.
Lo digo que pero bueno,
Try. También comprendo los padres y o sea, eso no son bien, ¿no? Bueno, que te I don't
I'm getting sick right now. I learned how to do a squat. Want me to show you? I can teach you how to do a squat.
I know. You're kind of lazy, man.
It's not very big.
No, they're actually very hard. You do with weights.
no sé.
I mean, when I started, like it was so hard to the right posture. ¿Dónde estás yendo? Or like,
Para recogernos temprano porque había mucha nieve. Yo no manejé. Estaba actualizando y hoy en la mañana yo sé no, a mí me pasó eso ayer. Voy a morir, no me quedo. Bueno, yo más o menos me dije, no muero yo sola, si yo voy a estar en mi casa, una angustia horrorosa. Pero hay un puente, como para entrar, hay un puente.
I left my dad. Sí veo, but I go to them like permanently.
So at least I didn't have to where did you meet?
Part of it is.
Where real life.
Yeah. Well, like you left. I see. And it's other different. Knows everything.
But like, there were some buyers who was stuff.
I recognize him.
Siempre hablamos.
Es algo que no había querido para variar. Para variar.
Lo que no
Por razón todo el mundo se me cae los
Friends.
Lo que no pone como buena pero él pero cuando llegó acá estaba terminado en las mujeres. Ya.
Es horrible.
Ya estábamos. Ayer sí me tocó manejar. Yo tenía que ir a dormir. En la casa. Se comieron todo lo que había, lo que no había. Impresionante. Se comentó. Yeah, I have
Desayuné un guisado de bistec que está sonando con papas, un horario de México.
I have pretty much. Yeah. But like the market is so hot right now. I've been to those, but yeah, the market is so bad. For street, my friends like, I'm not gonna have any problem. So I need a month.
Yeah, please. Okay. Let's say 5 years.
No, we work still.
En medio de una tormenta, más o menos lo que le hicieron al niño, no iba caminando. Como dicen, es un recuerdo.
Bueno, I don't If I had like a couple of right? Like, yeah.
Y tus favores están desesperados por contratar más gente de ahí. Somebody needs pero vino, lo mandaron a
Sí, estamos aquí. Pero sí, los caminos así están.
Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. It is my pleasure to welcome back David Samuels to the Kellogg Institute and to Notre Dame. He's been here many times before my time, but much later. But we've been reading his work and a lot of topics that have been prominent here. He's Distinguished McKnight University Professor of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. The comparativist, the political economist, a behaviorist, a Latin Americanist, a Brazilianist, but above all, he's like a comparativist, right? Like, I don't know, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that David has made contributions more than anyone to more areas of comparative politics. early on, he wrote,
I'm a dilettante, you're saying.
no, a Renaissance man, I would say. He wrote three really important books on different areas of federalism, like on the effect of electoral systems, the causes and consequences of federalism, as well as separation of power system versus fusion of power systems. But I think he later turned attention to issues of political economy and political behavior. I mean, of note is his book, Ruben Ansel, Inequality and Democratization, an Elite Competition Approach, that won the American Political Science Association Best Book Award on Politics, Government, and International Affairs, and also a William Riker Award for Best Book in Political Economy. So he's going to be talking more about his research on political behavior, a lot of which is with Cesar Zucco and Fernando Metro. That is based on an early book, very recent, but prior book called Partisans, Anti-Partisan, and Non-Partisans Voting Behavior in Brazil, in which they focus on negative partisanship as a dimension that shapes polarization in weak party systems. And today he's going to talk about a project that relates to this, that kind of tries to trace the roots of this polarization. So two announcements. One is that David has generously agreed to give a talk later, a presentation on the process of publication at CPS, because he's the longtime editor of CPS. That's very helpful. That will be at 4 p.m. in this room, so you're invited. And lastly, I want to tell our attendants online that they can make comments and questions below the viewing screen online. So thank you, David, for being here.
Thanks, Luis. It's great to be back. Thanks for the invitation. I've been here a few times over the years and watching the campus grow. It looks very much like Minneapolis today. Feels like Minneapolis today, which is not exactly what I want when I travel, but I still appreciate it greatly. So I want to start by noticing, like, this is one of the first talks that I've done where I tried to use ChatGPT's image creator, and it worked out pretty well, right? I think the Pechismo image, but it's also a warning for everybody in terms of ChatGPT and its image generation, because when I first put in Pechismo, so how many people speak Portuguese here? Few, right? So in Portuguese, the word pet, P-E-T, means what you think it might mean, which means pet. And but pechista is spelled P-E-T-I-S-T-A. And so when I put in pechista, ChatGPT interpreted it literally to mean this. You're a pechista, you're very much a fan of pets. In Brazil, they could say, or usually an animal I esteem would be my pet, but they just say pet. And so, but little retriever puppy and a black cat is like pechista. So I got a good laugh at that, because I'm very much so pechista, my little Maggie there in a warmer climate at the lake or on the water. But anyway, so it was great. Ended up a little tweak, as with ChatGPT, you have to tweak it a little bit. So the starting point, the real starting point of the talk and what the research is that this is about the divide between pechistas and anti-pechistas. Pechistas are people who support the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil. That's what they're called. And anti-pechistas are negative partisans. They don't have a party of their own. And talk a lot about what a negative partisan means. But it is a partisan attitude. It is an outgroup. There's only an outgroup. There's no in-group that you love, but there's an outgroup that you hate. And this is just a timeline of the growth of pechismo and anti-pechismo in the electorate, in the Brazilian electorate. And you can see there's a pechistas, the little square dots, so it's about 30% now, and the upside down triangles are anti-pechistas, and it's probably a little higher today. And so either is well above 50% there a couple of years ago. Somewhere between 60, maybe even 70%, it depends on the year, of Brazilians are either a pechista or an anti-pechista. And again, the way you figure this out is, of course, you ask people in a survey, is there a party that you like? You say yes, you say which. And same thing, or anti-pechista. You say, is there a party you don't like? And they say yes, you say, well, which one? And so it's a very simple kind of question. And you think, well, that seems very thin. But Cesar and I both came out 8 years ago. Actually, it's not so new. We spent a lot of time basically probing how real are these attitudes? How deep are they? And the point of the book was these are really important social kind of they're inside people's heads, social attributes. And that Brazilians are affectively polarized by partisan attitudes. People who are partisans, and I should say people, not the so-called non-partisans, but partisans are affectively polarized. They prefer social distancing in one group and the other. They stereotype each other. There's a paper we just published in LOPS. They are more polarized on policy. More than that, policy polarization in Brazil is a function of partisanship. That is, polarization about policy is endogenous to partisanship. I find myself having to really emphasize this point because it has very important methodological implications. If you do a survey and you run a cross-sectional regression and you just throw everything in there, partisanship and all these other attitudes, you're doing it wrong because all the other stuff is endogenous to the partisan value. And of course, when people do this, they find partisanship and negative partisanship are the most important explanatory variables for, say, predicting who you're going to vote for. And my attitude is, well, of course, that's in the US, it's the same in all sorts of countries. But more than that, the attitudes about policy are a function of motivated reasoning by pechistas and anti-pechistas. And we showed this with a little survey experiment. And this motivated reasoning idea does not apply to people who are Lulistas or Bolsonaristas, who are not pechistas or anti-pechistas. So these people will say, yeah, I like Lula, I like Bolsonaro. But if they're not a pechista or they're not an anti-pechista, they don't have this kind of motivated reasoning going on in their head. They're not polarized, that is. So this is part of my story here is like, Brazil is not polarized based on if you like Lula, you like Bolsonaro. But there's plenty of people who say, I like Bolsonaro, but they're not that polarized. Or they like Lula, but they're not that polarized effectively or about policy. It really is a function of the partisan attitudes. That's what's driving polarization in Brazil. Where am I now? 5, 6. But the question, of course, is, so if you throw pechismo, anti-pechismo in a regression, it's a dummy, 1, 0, 1, 0. What does this mean? Right? It's just a dummy variable. And we all know this, like that's great that we can be so simple about things methodologically, but what does that mean? What does it signify? And that's unclear. There's literally zero research on pechismo as a worldview in Brazil, by Brazilians, by us gringo Brazilianists. There's not surveys, whatever interviews, there's just no general research on pechismo from the 80s, the 90s, 2000. What does it mean ideologically? As some kind of set worldview. How do you understand polarization in Brazil when there's no research on pechismo among voters? Forget about anti-pechismo. There's no research on anti-pechismo and pechismo together. Now, are they mirror images of each other? Are they different sorts of worldviews? In what ways? To what extent? There's just not much out there. So that's what we're trying to explore in this broader project I'm going to talk about today. Now, that said, there are stories, there are conventional wisdoms out there, and particularly about anti-pechismo, about the right side. It's kind of impressive to me. Pechismo has been around for 40, almost 50 years, and there's not a lot of conventional wisdom about what is a pechista in the Brazilian electorate. And one of the conventional stories about anti-pechismo is that it's elitist, it's classist. This is a cover from the news magazine Veja, which is pretty conservative. And it's basically saying, you tomorrow, you're going to be you white dude with a white collar, upper middle, definitely elite almost guy. You're going to be doing the dishes, God forbid, right? That's it's about race and gender and social class, all in this one picture. And there's something elitist and classist and even gendered. So why? Oh, because these new labor laws. This is in Portuguese, it's a civilizing mark for Brazil, but a signal that soon domestic work is going to be divided among the whole family. Why? Because maids are getting too expensive. And so that's, again, it's kind of, well, there's black women, mostly 90-something% of them, maids. It's like, well, yeah, the new labor laws meant that they got overtime and they had paid leave and all that stuff. And it was getting expensive for a lot of people who can't afford a maid anymore. Similar story here is during the protests that eventually impeached Dilma. I love this picture. You can read Portuguese, manifestantes vão às ruas. I'm like, that's not a street. Rua is the word for street. Protesting against Dilma. And Dilma out. It's like there's the word for a street protest is passeata from the verb passear. So you're gonna walk around, right? I call this a yachiata for the yacht. These are not average people, right, protest. So this is the kind of course, this is what people want to see. It's like, yeah, all these people are out there protesting. Like, no, this is the 0.0001%, not even the 1%. Right? So yeah, this is an elitist protest in some way against, that's what they say. And this picture, I think, someone should write a anthropology dissertation of. This is a picture worth 10,000 words. And if you know Rio de Janeiro, you know exactly where this is. Actually, I think the Rei do Machi's closed, the Visconde de Corajá sign up there is just the name of the building. That's the street that it's on. It's in Ipanema. And these two people, they were later outed as just a banker and his wife, I think she's a lawyer or something like that. They're wearing the T-shirt of Flamengo, which usually is red and black. Flamengo is like the Dallas Cowboys of Brazil, or at least what the Dallas Cowboys used to be in terms of like the country's football team, right? But at some point, the Flamengo adopted the green and yellow as the Brazil's national colors for a while for their team flag for whatever. And so they're headed to a protest against Dilma. And not only did they bring their, a very, very expensive pet, right? They're pechistas, also they're not pechistas, they are anti-pechistas, right? But they made their nanny wear the completely, even 10 years ago, completely anachronistic white uniform and white shoes at the time. And come with them to this protest. And you can see the look on her face, I think, kind of speaks volumes. And they're just kind of trucking along there, right? And so I just remember pulling this picture. I was just like, I should write an article just on this picture. But this also speaks volumes, I think, about the nature of the divide. At least that's the impression I think a lot of people have taken away. Here's another example. So this Senator Marina Silva, who's a woman of color, and she's, whether it's Black and indigenous, mixed, whatever it is, I don't know. This other senator was saying, you need to stay in your lane, lady. And she said, basically, screw you. I am not a submissive woman. And you can't boss me around. We're both senators. She was really mad. She walked off the floor eventually like that. She's from the PT. She's a long-term senator from the PT, ran for president a couple of times. And so you can see there's a gender aspect to here. So people say, oh, Bolsonarismo is very masculine dominated. Pechismo will be dominated by women. There's a racial aspect here too. This is a CCTV. Again, if you know Rio, you can probably walk along this path. It's this path to the beach from the main street right between Copacabana and Ipanema. And it leads to this great view of Ipanema Beach. And so what this is saying, Betty Faria is a very famous actress in Brazil. She's there on Twitter, basically saying that this tweet originally was saying from Globo is saying images are showing a group of people who are mugging people in this passageway, in this alley, and it's called Padrão. They're being very aggressive. And so Betty Faria is saying these are the children of Bolsa Familia recipients who didn't use birth control. So just a completely vulgar kind of saying basically this government policy is responsible for an increase in crime at this moment in Rio de Janeiro. Blaming the policy, but connecting it to chaos in the streets, just these young people from the favelas, meaning Blacks engaging in crime. So there's a racial aspect, and there's also a classist aspect. I think this one's really funny, kind of sad. It's like, so again, in I think it was on the Veja website, a restaurant has left this sign blaming Pessoal do Bolsa Familia, people who receive Bolsa Familia, for their absence. The sign basically says, customers, please be patient with us. The welfare recipients and drunks don't want to work, so we don't have enough people to help. Thank you. And it's literally this Fresh House. You could Google them. I mean, it's like a Fresh and Green kind of chain, salad place or whatever like that. So they're blaming Bolsa Familia again for being lazy. So this is kind of getting towards what I'm going to really be talking about. Kind of attitudes people towards Bolsa Familia recipients and other beneficiaries of government programs in Brazil. This is a government propaganda piece about Bolsa Familia, but it's obviously not just a conscious choice that they chose a single Black moms, but those 90% of Bolsa Familia recipients are basically women of color and their families. And so there's not just a stereotype, but there's some reflection of reality here in terms of Brazilian social policy. So when I'm getting at with these stories is the kind of usual suspects people talk about when they're saying, well, Brazil and polarization, it's about race, it's about class, it's about gender, it's demographic categories. And of course, these don't have meaning themselves, but this is a conventional story. We hear a lot, we've seen it written a lot in terms of predicting a vote for president or talking about polarization in Brazil. But what I want to show you now is some results from a national survey that we did a year or so ago. And the point of this here is what we're saying is that what are the proportions of people who are pechistas or antipechistas or nonpartisans broken down by demographic categories. And so what you can see there is, like, if you start on the upper left, is like, yeah, there's a slight advantage among for the PT among women, but there's no difference in terms of the proportion of pechistas and antipechistas who are women. You go through every, it's I have to be careful how I say this, right? But when you look at the non-whites, like, yeah, there's probably a larger proportion of non-whites among pechistas than antipechistas. Important fact to know, 55% of Brazil's population identifies as non-white. It's basically of Afro-Brazilian descent or mixed in that way. And if you look at the baseline, there are 47 as the non-partisans. It's like, again, there's no statistical difference here. You think about in the US, like, of blacks, like, if you ask them, I don't know, of the people who identify with the party in the US, 90% would say Democrats, 10% would be Republicans. And that's really important to say, like, oh, about 50% of antipechistas identify as non-white. And if you think back, well, what proportion of Brazilians identify as antipechistas? Between 30 and 40%. I'll do the math. This means that between 15 and 20% of Brazilians are non-white antipechistas. In other words, between 10 and 20% larger proportion than the number of Black Republicans in the United States. Now, if you study American politics and you try to find research on Black Republicanism, there's not much out there because it's really hard to survey them, and even finding for focus groups would be really hard. I don't have any problem finding Black conservatives in Brazil for a survey or a focus group, as I will show you, but it really raises some questions, right? Especially because there's no real significant difference, whether it's gender or race, social class, again, men, white people, social, whether they're upper middle class or lower, class D, that's how Brazilians rank kind of social classes. A is the top, E would be the poorest. Again, no clear demographic differences. I can show you a couple more here. Big deal made in Brazil about evangelicals being on the conservative side. And oh yeah, it sure looks like it up right there, but there's a huge bar around pechistas. And, in terms of atheists, no, there's not much of a difference there, but whether it's young, there's a stereotype that pechistas would be older, but again, slight, but no, there's no real, in other words, my point is here about these demographic categories is the groups look more alike than they look different. And there might be some differences, but if 60% of pechistas are non-white and 50% of antipechistas are non-white, that's not a cleavage, as we talk about in the study of voter behavior in political parties. There's something else going on. Demographics don't neatly divide Brazilian partisans from each other. I mean, and another problem is if you think about how to predict a presidential vote, people have used demographics to predict presidential vote. And well, there may be something going on among nonpartisans. I don't see much. These are sometimes statistically significant predictors. But again, if you look at the models people have published, partisanship is in the model, but partisanship predicts presidential vote. And so and since partisanship predicts attitudes, these models they don't really make any sense statistically. We really need to know the roots of partisanship and think about this as stages. I don't know if there's a kind of culture statistical way to do it, but in our brains, think about, well, what causes partisanship? And then we can think about, well, how partisanship then predicts other forms of political behavior, including presidential vote, but other forms of behavior would be important too. So the fact that a large proportion of Pechistas and for example, anti-pechistas are women, not white, and not well off, really to me suggests we can't reduce anti-pechismo to white racism, male sexism, elitist classism. What stands out for me with these results is that these demographic groups are so divided by partisanship. Meaning we really have to look beyond these demographic categories to explain what divides Brazilian voters. And that's where ChatGPT helped me make this nice figure. And this is really what we think it's about. And what as I explain this, I really hope you all kind of go at the end was like, that makes like really intuitive in a sense, because what I'm going to say, it is not anything conceptually novel about the differences between progressives and conservatives. In fact, this is really quite old idea about what it is that divides left from right. You can look at any classic understanding of the meaning of what a right versus left, and it's about understanding of inequalities and what government should do about them. But what's maybe fortunate for us is that this is not what everybody's talking about when they're doing research on voter behavior in Brazil. So in some senses, what we're talking about here is kind of Rawls versus Nozick, if you studied any of that, or Amartya Sen versus Hayek, something like that. Some people talk about culture and tradition, cultural values, and that's not orthogonal to what we're talking about, but that doesn't fully overlap with what we're talking about. And so we're going to focus on this dimension about attitudes towards inequalities. And we think this is the key divide between Pechistas and anti-Pechistas. It's about the importance, what we think about the relative importance of structural inequalities of race, social class, gender, and about whether these structural inequalities exist and are important and merit remedy, or whether you think merit and individual effort is more important in shaping social mobility. And so again, it's like, we hope is our contribution. So a few other scholars have noted the importance of these kinds of divisions for explaining the divide between left and right, but there's very little actual research about voters themselves and how they think about these sorts of questions. And so our evidence in this project comes from the survey, some of which I already showed you, and from 22 focus groups that we did around the country in 6 different cities. It's Brasilia, São Bernardo do Campo, Salvador, Belo Horizonte, Curitiba, and Recife. So this kind of sample here was adults. How we stratified I think is really important because it allows us to compare with the quantitative evidence. So what we did was we asked people, is there a party? And yes, no, which one? Is there a party you hate? Okay, fine. We can separate people by partisanship. That's what we want to do, right? And then we asked, what we did was just separate people in qualitative research, they kind of draw a weird line between the middle of the Classe B, which is the Classe A is like the top 5% in Brazil, and B would be the next 15%. And so the researchers in public opinion did draw a kind of line between that. So you're getting, like, in the top group for us is not the 1%. They don't do focus groups, but upper middle class people. And then the next group, B2C, is like lower middle class. And the reason we're not asking people in B and E is because they don't do focus groups either. They're super hard to recruit. And based on the information we got from the professionals is even if they do show up, they don't talk. It's a terrible group. So we kind of cost benefits. It's like, well, we're gonna go with the people we can more easily recruit, and then we can compare with our quantitative evidence. We separated whites from non-whites and men from women in 16 of the 22 groups. Basically, after the first few groups where men dominated the conversation, we're like, yeah, we gotta basically separate the women from the men, and then see what we get. Let me just show you a few pictures of what we did, just to kind of, some of you your gears may be grinding in your head. It's like, well, what about, race in Brazil is kind of weird, right? And I'm like, I totally agree. This is a group of white antipetistas, and kind of self-identified antipetistas. And it's like, to me, like, I thought you'd be indigenous identified. This guy, like, to the gringo, like, I'm like, this guy's not white. But I was always in the room with Brazilians, and they were like, that guy's not white. And I'm like, but it's self-identification. So, okay, This is a group of non-white anti-pechistas. And what's interesting about this, no, pechistas, right? This is pechistas. And what's interesting about this was this guy, he walks in and everybody was like, what's up with that? Because that green and yellow t-shirt, only the anti-pechistas wear that. And, my co-author Larissa, she's one of my grad students, she's like, oh, this is wrong. He must have chosen the wrong group. But it turns out that's just this work uniform. He works in a paint shop and that's just on the back of it had the name of the paint shop. We just couldn't see that. So, you just never know what's going on. So this is a classy, the AB1 upper middle class, non-whites. And we tried really hard to match the moderator race and gender with the groups. So we couldn't find non-white moderators and some, which is kind of a sad commentary. In Salvador, it was impossible to find a non-white woman moderator. So we only had men's groups in Salvador. This is Recife, I think. This is white people in Recife, upper middle class. So what about these groups? Where am I? All right, let me just. So what we're doing in the focus groups is we're repeating essentially the questions we asked in the survey, and since our argument is about attitudes about inequalities, what we did was we brought in well-known batteries from survey research about attitudes about welfare, about race, and about gender. And so with welfare, I'm going to start with welfare. It's called deservingness perceptions. And welfare deservingness perceptions are these kinds of questions. Now, in the survey, we asked a longer battery of questions, but of course, for time, we had to shorten all these batteries. And so, are people lazy? Essentially, unemployed people. Does welfare make people lazy? Why are there poor people in Brazil? It's basically about structural inequalities or not. And so the question is, we would pose these questions. What do you think? And we'd go around the room and have a conversation. That's what you do with focus groups. Like I don't know how many years I've been doing this now, Scott. And it's like first time doing focus groups, and it's a lot of fun. It's super expensive and super time consuming because you want to be there for them. We were behind a one-way mirror, and so it's being taped. And you get the transcript later on. I was really glad to be there with Brazilians because. I remember when I was first learning Portuguese, like the hardest thing back in the day, we're old, right, was a phone conversation. Remember, like you can't see their lips. And even when I could see them talking through with the audio coming through, sometimes I wouldn't understand what they were saying, especially like if I'm up in Recife, like I don't know what the slang is these days in Recife. I don't know what the slang is anywhere in Brazil. So I had to get some translations, but I'm going to show you some of the translations of some of the more pertinent phrases. So here I've just shown some basic, the difference between pechistas and anti-pechistas. This is the summary. It's like about welfare deservingness. Pechistas basically think Brazil needs these programs and because they promote social mobility. And they describe the recipients in explicitly moral terms as deserving of the benefits of Bolsa Familia, for example. And the anti-pechistas are quite different. Very, and the great thing about the focus groups that we did was that they were completely consistent. And that was the point of separating men, women, blacks, whites, upper, lower middle classes. It didn't matter. The responses were always consistent with the few exceptions that I'm going to talk about. But with the welfare deservingness, they were all consistent across these demographic categories. So what am I see? It's like 25. I don't think I'm going to show you too many quotes about social welfare, direct quotes, because it was really simple. The responses were so clearly distinct across partisan lines, and pechistas affirming that poor people are victims of bad luck, and anti-pechistas saying poor people are lazy and unwilling to work and undeserving of these government handouts. But when you move to structural racism and the questions, we'll see some interesting distinctions. But so here are the questions, and again, we didn't make these up, right? These are coming from, I think it's Marty Gillen's book, Why Americans Hate Welfare, which is 20, 30 years old already now. And they've been used over and over again, these kind of, basically they're called racial resentment battery. And so some of you may have studied it as called implicit racism tests, and this is kind of where you get at that. And it's like, you're not asking people, do you hate black people or do you hate white people, whatever it is, you're asking them, what do you think about these kinds of things? Does structural racism really exists. Centuries of discrimination make it hard for Black people to escape poverty. Is racism common or is it rare? And so we asked these questions. We had a discussion about this among all of our recipients. Our hypothesis said that Black and white pechistas should basically agree about not just the importance of racism, but that it's a structural problem, that it limits Blacks' social mobility. So here I'll show you some pechistas comments. So, and you can see here that pechistas agree racism exists and that it impacts mobility. And they think that also that affirmative action is a legitimate policy. And so one thing I want to note here is like I'm cherry picking white respondents from the upper middle class. Like these are well-off people from Brazil's south, which is the rich part of the country. And these are all pechistas, and they're all basically saying white pechistas saying the same thing, essentially, that yes, racism exists and it's a problem. And here I'll switch to a group of upper middle class women from Belo Horizonte. And the thrust of the discussion about affirmative action was, again, we support it. And these are white women saying we support affirmative action because it's the only way to get some social mobility for people of color in Brazil. It's the only way to get racial justice. So it's kind of stereotypical pechistas in a way. It's like, yeah, but the key point was like, it doesn't matter if they're men, doesn't matter if they're white, doesn't matter, whatever. Pechistas all agree about these principles. All right, let me show you some anti-pechistas here. And so here I'm cherry picking from a group of upper middle class white women from Belo Horizonte. And you can see here is the denial of the existence of racism first. From the get-go, the anti-pechistas denied the existence of racism. And the same thing here is, let me check, just find this last thing. Is like they would even throw it back and say, it's just an excuse for their own failures. And so there's a deep current of meritocratic individualism running underneath these comments here. And so when you turn to affirmative action, so this is a group of whites, again, in Brasilia. And this kind of was a typical comment, was like, look at me, man, I'm white. My parents were illiterate and I grew up in the favela. That was the hand that I got dealt, but I made something of my life. And who gets opportunities today's? Well, there's only scholarships for Black people. And they would all kind of go around the table, and end with these kind of comments. It's like, is anybody, willing to fly with an affirmative action pilot? Piloto cotista is what they would say in Brazil. So among the white anti-pechistas is kind of fitting in clearly with our hypothesis that, racism doesn't exist. And so affirmative action is therefore an illegitimate policy. Well, it's interesting when we turn to non-white anti-pechistas. Those of you who studied Brazil, is like there's this longstanding ideology of racial democracy. You read about this. This idea that racism doesn't exist was propagated by its white elites to kind of tamp down the idea that Brazil needs reform. And in fact, there wasn't a lot of Jim Crow and all that stuff, right? But here we have some quotes from, again, now lower middle class Black men in Salvador, which is the heart and soul of Afro-Brazilian culture in Brazil, right? And again, the reason Brazil has 55% non-whites is because they had a much larger proportion of slaves up through 1889 than in the US. And so here's the interesting thing. In those of you who speak Portuguese, it's like herança maldita, cursed legacy, for a Black in Salvador to say, a Black anti-pechista in Salvador to say, yes, racism exists. It is a legacy Brazil carried with us. Was not expecting. Did not expect this, right? But on the other hand, hey, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, these are the guys who are living it every day, right? They say racism is common, racism exists. However, when you ask them about affirmative action, they sound just like white anti-pechistas. They say, no, I don't support affirmative action. It reinforces discrimination against us. They would say, I don't want a fellowship. I don't want a job. where I'm given it because of the color of my skin. That devalues me. The complete opposite of what Pechistas were saying. And so I was like, well, this is an old debate in the US. It's like in Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois. It's today, Clarence Thomas. There is Black conservative intellectual in the US that have made this argument. It doesn't have wide appeal. But in Brazil, there's nobody really making these kinds of arguments, but it has really wide appeal among Afro-Brazilians. So there's some cognitive dissonance among non-white Pechistas. They sound exactly like Pechistas in agreeing racism exists, but then they deny racism matters for social mobility, sounding exactly like white Pechistas. I just think this is really interesting, kind of parenthetically for me, developing a project like, what is it that can we really, I think it's really important that when 20% of Brazilians are Black conservative, anti-Pechistas, and nobody's really explored their attitudes in terms of voter behavior. So I'm trying to figure out how to dig deeper in that. But for now on, for this project, we'll just move on to our third aspect. And so what I've said is about welfare attitudes. On the right, it's meritocratic individualism. On the left, it's basically Rawlsian egalitarianism, give people a leg up. On race, a similar kind of pattern. It's like on the left, it's like, yes, we have structural racism and the government should do something about it. That's why I'm a Pechista. On the right, it's the opposite. No, racism might exist, but or not if you're white. But regardless, the government should not do anything about it. People should rise up on their own merits or not. And with gender, what we did was we took batteries of questions developed, and they're called hostile or benevolent sexism, and we kind of adapted them for the Brazilian context. I think it's important to set the discussion about gender in the kind of conventional view of attitudes in Brazil that focus on traditional values, like right versus left is about traditional values. And we say, no, that's not really what it's about. There's a concept out there called modern sexism that really, I think, is much more useful for explaining what's going on in Brazil. And it's modern sexism differs from traditional sexism, which says women are inferior and should be treated as such. Modern sexism says, no, women are equal. And therefore, feminism is unnecessary. And you see a lot of this in the US, they see a lot of this in Europe. I mean, getting this from a lot of research on Europe. And so what we did is we decided to ask a couple of these kind of hostile sexism ones about feminists and women interpreting innocent comments as sexist, and then the more benevolent sexism where the idea is women should be treated, they're distinct, and they should be put on a pedestal. They have a purity that men don't have, and their roles should be as mothers, and men should have particular roles. And there's a lot of debate about this in every community, right? But I wanted to emphasize something about the idea here is that if women are already equal, right? If you believe that feminism is illegitimate, women are already equal, so there's nothing to fix. That's why they would say feminism is illegitimate, and women could just lean in, right? And that's the famous phrase, right? And achieve whatever goals they want to achieve. So the PT, anti-PT divide, in this sense, boils down to belief about whether government engagement and activism policies are necessary to reduce structural inequalities of gender. And so let's look at some Pechistas. Well, actually, what I want to do with this slide is have you take a look, and I want you to guess which side is the Pechista and which side is the anti-Pechista side. These are two conversations we had in response to this statement. We were trying to probe this traditional values type conventional view about anti-Pechistas. One is from anti-Pechistas and one is from Pechistas. I'm seeing some smiles. It was a very enjoyable conversation. We were laughing, they were laughing. By this time in the focus groups, everybody knew they were among friends, politically, socially, whatever, racially. As you can tell, the only thing that I think is the giveaway is this line, which is, this is the Pechista line. This is the Pechista group. Same. I'm going to sleep with whoever I want, essentially. This is not about traditional values, right? Let's get something really clear here. Like the anti-Pechista women were just as open about sexual autonomy as the Pechista And so this stereotype, oh, Pachistas are all wacky, liberal. No. These women, it's like, if I know what I want, I'm going to get it. And some of the women were like, well, that's okay with you, but it's not for me. And they're like, well, that's fine. And this is in the Anti-Pachista group. And they were like, yeah, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And the Pachistas were the same way. And so we just all reacted like this is uncanny kind of similarity here in what we're seeing in these groups. And so this is kind of clearly the entree to this modern sexism notion. So let's look. The feminists are making fair demands. So here we have a group of non-whites, the lower class men from Salvador. And they're like, yeah, these Pachistas, like, yeah, I think feminism is awesome, right? It shouldn't be necessary, but it's a necessary struggle. And this is something women need, that we need feminism because the job is not done. We haven't achieved equality yet. But when you look at the Pachistas, I'm surprised in a way, right? This is, again, so just the parallel group in Salvador of non-white, lower middle class men, same city, right? No. The feminism is ridiculous, right? They're fighting for, they're out there making fools of themselves in the streets, fighting for unnecessary things, right? It's too radical. And all they're doing is they want power. It's a special interest group. Some women wanting power over men. And we saw this repeatedly kind of from Anti-Pachista groups. Yeah, that's great. So are women interpreting comments as sexist? Oh yeah, the Anti-Pachistas are like, the key here is in this one. If a man called a woman hot back in the day, it was great. The woman could even be like, yeah, and they were like, yeah, I agree. Now if you call someone hot, you're harassing me. I'm gonna send you. I'm gonna call the police on you. So we tell all sorts of stories about this. Now it's interesting that on these gender role things, it's like there's some agreement. So, women can do whatever they want. Again, it's like from Anti-Pachistas, they're not advocating for traditional gender roles. No, they're advocating sexual autonomy. They're saying women can choose to have kids or they can choose not to have kids, and it's all okay. But there's this thing about femininity or feminism, right? This is a great conversation among Anti-Pachistas that we had. And we saw a number, like this is just the best one. If a man makes the money, well, he should pay for everything, and I'm willing to be submissive to him. I'm willing to be second in sex. That's the man's role. No, it's his obligation to be the breadwinner. There's this real ambivalence among Anti-Pachistas. And the hilarious thing was at the end there was like, and they were all kind of friendly, right? But at the end, it's like, my man pays for everything, even my Botox. It's like, even your Botox, send me his number. I want it. If you leave him, don't ever leave him. But if you do, send me his number. It means they were really kind of playing around with it. It was really kind of funny. So there's this paradox, right? The Anti-Pachistas say, well, women are equal, we should have this equality, but they long for these traditional gender roles, even if they express opposition to them. This is the benevolent sexism or modern sexist combination of support for equality and meritocratic individualism with this longing for a hierarchy. And that totally kind of contradicts the idea central to meritocratic individualism, which is kind of horizontal equality. And here's just my last slide here. It's like back to the survey. What we then do is say, all right, well, what about welfare deservingness? I'm going to move over here, or actually I'll just do it over here. So we have welfare deservingness by social class. So here we have the red lines would be upper middle class, the blue lines would be the lower class, and this includes the poor. And you can see is among Pachistas, a very low level of opposition to welfare, you could say versus among Anti-Pachistas, very high undeservingness perceptions, and no differences really between rich and poor. The huge difference, and you can see, is between Pachistas and Anti-Pachistas with nonpartisans in the middle, because they're not polarized. Right? And the same pattern exists here. Nonpartisans, we say, nice to see, have relatively low racial resentment levels, along with Pachistas, whether they're white or non-white. And there's a large difference between Pachistas of both races and Anti-Pachistas of both races. Again, it's partisanship dominating the conversation, not demographics. Same thing here with the hostile sexism, men versus women. the comments about feminism, like men and women, not much of a difference. Maybe men are a little on the anchipechista side, or maybe significantly more hostile than women. But look at the gap between women anchipechistas and women pechistas. That's large, really large gap there. So kind of confirming here are that anchipechistas and pechistas disagree with each other across demographic lines, race, class, and gender. So just kind of wrapping things up here. Again, with the ChatGPT helpful images here. I'm going to restate my key point is that pechistas and anchipechistas are demographically more similar than they are and different. And what we really want to know, I think what we're really trying to unpack here is what attitudes are common within each partisan group across these demographic lines, these racial, class, and gender lines. And so we're hoping our contribution is to show that pechistas and anchipechistas have core, kind of coherent ideologies or worldviews that reflect classic beliefs, kind of core differences between progressives and conservatives, beliefs about different forms of inequality. And just to close, I'd say that this method can't rule out things like authoritarianism, but it was noteworthy, 22 groups. The things that didn't bark were its traditional values, the dogs that didn't bark, evangelical Christianity. We raised this issue at the start and no one ever brought it up again. Corruption, no one ever talked about corruption except when the conservatives were talking about how programs like Bolsa Familia corrupt voters' minds, but they weren't concerned about theft. Law and order, none of that was ever mentioned. I will note, though, that every single anchipechista group, when we were talking about gender, turned it into a discussion about LGBT people, especially trans people. And that was not true in any of the PT groups. It was about women. The gender discussion remained about women. And this, I think our findings raise a lot more questions about conservative women and what is it that makes the choice about femininity over feminism, or what does whiteness or blackness mean in Brazil, so that much larger proportion of Black Brazilians choose conservatism than in the United States. There's a lot of literature on that, but again, connecting it to the voter behavior side is really the interesting question for me these days. So thanks for listening to me babble for a little while, and now I'll open it up to take questions. I guess I'll just take the questions myself. I'm gonna just get rid of this and sit down and speak as if over clips.
That he has agreed to fill his own questions, so.
All right. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This was super fascinating and very resonant, I think, with other contexts.
Yeah.
Have to do the work. I have a question about so the attitudes. So your claim is that the attitudes, the kind of fundamental difference is in attitudes towards kind of the possibility that structural inequalities exist and the possibility of social mobility.
Right.
But the data that you present also shows a kind of fundamental difference in what the role of the state should be vis-a-vis those things. And so I wonder if you could help us disentangle those two, because I think that seems like another fundamental difference.
I think that it's the question about the role of the state and these policies just flows from this difference. Because so, for example, if you recognize that economic inequality exists and is a structural obstacle to social mobility, the next step, and maybe I just didn't give this enough attention, is to accept that Bolsa Familia is a legitimate response to that, and that the recipients deserve the money coming from the government. Whereas if you're an anchipechista, it's all about bootstrapping, and no, you just got to work harder, and that's where the people, Bolsa Familia, the restaurant, showing that the Bolsa Familia recipients are just lazy and addicted to government spending. So I should add that what we're really trying to figure out is a way to show that the meaning of this divide between pechismo and anchipechismo is fundamentally a function of Lula's election. That we can't say much about what pechismo meant prior to 2003, but that once the PT took office, that it put its principles into action. And we have guesses, like anchipechismo is about chaos and strikes and not unrelated issues, but that today it's about a policy feedback effect. Now, this is really, really hard to show in any context. But that in all three of these areas, and Bolsa Familia is just the most famous version of kind of social welfare policy. But so, for example, the Veja cover that I showed is clearly, a very quick reaction to new labor laws passed in Lula's first term, I think, 2005, maybe a little later, that incorporated like 10 million Black women out of the informal sector into the formal sector of the economy, gave them government benefits for the first time. And this had massive impacts on the household standard of living for people like this guy in this picture. And probably contributed to, over the years, when you add in affirmative action, it's this, an affirmative action in the US, talking about a tiny, tiny policy. But in Brazil, it's like hundreds of thousands of university admission spots and tens or hundreds of thousands of public sector jobs over years and years and years and years and years. And so it's really had a much broader effect. And so do you support these? And that's what we're trying to get at. Why? It's like, well, you have particular philosophical views, and maybe you've never articulated them as Rawls would or as Nozick would on the other side. But that's really what's behind, not just I like Bolsa Familia or I don't like Bolsa Familia. Make sense? Okay. All right, that's it. I'm out of here.
I have a question. So this is super thought-provoking. I'm wrapping my head around the argument. So two things. So one reaction, I had similar thoughts, is so if this is a policy feedback argument, I'm not sure that I would expect non-class differences, right? As you very convincingly show, I'm taking that from this talk, right? Like I think I'm completely convinced that there is much more similarity in demographics than the stereotype would suggest. But my expectation from a policy feedback story is that then you would see things that click by class. In fact, some of the things you showed early on are very indicative of class stereotypes, right? Like stereotyping people on Ecuador by, based on Bolsa Familia and lack of birth control is a very classist thing. But then the evidence is so why is policy feedback not cleaving? I think policy feedback is different here. Policy feedback is kind of a critical juncture that then gave kind of a signal along which ideologically based divisions emerge.
The problem with policy feedback argument and with analyzing it, it's more a problem with analyzing it, is that I don't think it's right to think about it as if you get Bolsa Familia, you're in favor of it. And so if you're not eligible for it, so if you're rich, you're going to be opposed because they're taking your tax money and giving to some undeserving poor person. No, that's not it. Number one, among well-off people, there are plenty of well-off people who say, like, I'm willing to pay the taxes. So they're more progressive people. But there's actually really interesting anthropological work among lower class people. And you see this in our focus groups all the time. The anthropological work goes into a favela or a rural poor community and talks to people who are either recipients of Bolsa Familia or not. And the particularly interesting responses of people who don't get it are there's as much of a split among poor people as there is among rich people, because there are plenty of poor people who are saying, my neighbor gets Bolsa Familia and all she does is buy beer. She sits around and drinks. Whereas I wasn't eligible because I make $7 more than the limit. So I don't get it. And she deliberately doesn't work. So there's this very, intuitive kind of neighborly animosities. So we heard this for Minha Casa Minha Vida, the housing distribution program. It's a lottery. And so you would hear these comments. It's like, my neighbor got a Minha Casa Minha Vida lottery winner. He got this house and all he does is rent it out on Airbnb. It's just super resentful. People's like, I invested my time and energy in buying this lot and building up, it took me years to build my house on this lot. They're super resentful. But these are poor, they're both poor people. And so there are people who are not just recipients, but people who believe among the poor and the rich that the policies are justified for these ideological, or whatever you want to call them, philosophical reasons. So this is what we found is in our poor groups is and it's a chicken and egg question. It's like, well, did the partisanship come before the attitudes about Bolsa Familia? And it's like, well, I have to say that, right? I don't know exactly, but that's what we're trying to figure out is how people come to these conclusions about what's right and what's wrong. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor in this particular example. And I think it's it's the easier example for me to say is it doesn't matter if you're black or white about affirmative action, or if you're a man or a woman about these policies that say promote gender equality. So across these three categories, the divide is much less important than some people seem to have predicted or would have predicted. Make sense?
So that makes sense to me, but I think it's an interesting twist because it's
Yeah.
kind of policy feedback operating through a different mechanism, which is not
Yeah.
necessarily reflecting existing cleavages or cleavages that are made by the policy, but it's raising the settings
I think what's
of certain issues.
what you see is
Slightly different to what we tend to associate.
That's exactly what it's about. The policy feedback literature has never said like, what we want to do is survey people and ask them, do you receive this policy? Do you receive this policy? Do you receive this policy? It's more like, do you approve of this policy? Do you approve of it?
Right.
Put a thermometer score. Because generally there are too few people who are recipients of the policy. But it's more about what is your general view of recipients of or beneficiaries of this kind of policy. Because of the way people talk about the policy. And that's what we're talking about. It's like, whether it's Social Security or welfare or affirmative action in an American context, it's like, and people differentiate between Social Security and welfare. It's like, that's my money, Social Security, right? I deserve that. And I work for it, but welfare, but it's all government policy, right? And Social Security is a subsidy for some people, right? And takes from some people. But so it's more about the kind of philosophical attitudes people have about the necessity of these government policies to address inequalities. Scott. Yeah.
David, thanks. Great, interesting work. There are a lot of questions I'd love to ask, but I'll maybe limit it to one or two. I'm not sure whether you're arguing that people's values on these issues lead them into partisan, pachismo versus anti-pachismo, or vice versa, or you're agnostic on that question. That is, it's more, more correlational than one thing leading to another. And then I might just ask about something that you didn't talk much about. You mentioned it, but I'm a little bit surprised. You said that cultural values don't pop up as that important. I find that surprising because, some of the literature has argued that Brazil, historically, there was never a big cultural divide over issues such as abortion, gay rights until 2018. But the common wisdom, as you know, is that this is a really important cleavage today. Generated in good measure, but probably not exclusively, by the rapid growth of evangelicals in the last couple generations. So I'm just curious to hear, I mean, in a focus group, the leader can tilt questions. Is it possible that these questions didn't come up because of, the moderators?
Possibly, but I think not. Let's see if I don't think I have anything about LGBTQ issues. So let me go back to your first question. I don't know. We're not trying to claim any kind of causal identification and put it baldly like that. And also, I think, I don't know, just generally. And I think to be fair, I don't think anybody knows. If you look at the literature on party ID and, what is the root of party ID? I was talking to Jasmine this morning about this. What does the literature tell us about why people are Democrats or Republicans? Like, some of it's genetic, which is kind of scary, right? You do these twin studies and you find that identical twins vote similarly more than fraternal twins, more than siblings. That's kind of scary, right? Number two, it's nature, it's also nurture. So it could be your parents, or what they talk about, or your community. Some of it is formative experiences. So there's a literature on what makes a feminist, and it says, well, when you're in high school, did you have a woman teacher who made an impression on you as a girl? When you're in college, did you take a course for whatever reason on gender, or that brought up gender, or that had a woman professor and made an impression on you? Now, can you run a model with that? No, right? The same kind of questions you would ask about partisans, like there's just like a holy grail, big mystery for political science, and it may be one of those unanswerable questions. But can we say that these things run together and that they are more important, let me say, than say being an evangelical Christian or not? Yes, they are. I can put these, not this one, but I can put this demographic divide thing up again. So yeah, there's clearly a higher probability of 0.3 versus 0.2, 0.33 versus 0.23, but it's not, 83% of evangelicals are anchpechistas, or that 83% of anchpechistas are evangelical, however you want to use it as the denominator. And the same thing is why it's like, is religiosity important? Religiosity differentiates pechistas and anchpechistas. But Brazilians are just religious, right? So what is it about being, I agree, there's a huge transformation in Latin America generally, the rise of evangelical Christianity. But a lot of people are like, well, I was born Catholic, now I'm evangelical, or I go to a Catholic church now, but I went to an evangelical in the past. In the Pechista groups, they're like, I'm religious, but I'm a Buddhist, so what is that? They're a person of faith in some way. So we were kind of stumped about that, but we opened the door to talking about Catholics and evangelicals at the very start of all of the focus groups. And it was really unusual, in having 12 groups, and I think of anchpechistas, maybe 2 women said, well, in my church, we do it this way, or my church teaches. It was really rare, and no one continued the thread. So the script stayed the same for all of these groups, and we were pretty careful to tell people to stick to the script and basically just make sure everybody had a chance to answer the why question when we posed the phrase. So I do think that there are cultural differences, no doubt, between pechistas and anchpechistas. So for example, when I mentioned the thing about LGBTQ being raised when talking about gender, and this is really common when you start reading about right-wing populism and gender, that the anchpechistas make discussions about feminism into a discussion about particularly trans people. And the reason is because it circles back to their paradoxical ambivalence about traditional gender roles. They're afraid, trans people in particular, and LGBTQ people are seeking power to undermine their roles as women and undermine, I'm talking about a women's group, and undermine men's roles. And they're particularly afraid for their children. Like, they're fine with gay people, for example, but not fine with their kids being gay because they're afraid they're going to get beat up or killed if they're trans people. Whereas pechistas don't express that kind of fear. And so it's about family. And it's like, that's such traditional value. I'm not going to deny that, right? But they think feminism is the problem, not the solution. And so for us, it really circles back to this general belief about a problem of structural inequalities of gender, and I could say, parentheses, and sexuality. Now, for a pechista, if we had raised the issue, I'm sure we've had an interesting conversation, but they kept the discussion about gender because they were talking about gender inequalities and their belief that they still exist. Anchpechistas immediately switch away into this discussion about family structures because they blame feminism itself. This is the modern sexist kind of insight that I didn't create. This is other people creating this idea about modern sexism. So for us, these cultural values always circle back to this question about the existence or not of structural inequalities. It's always about, in this case, about gender. But we see these patterns across gender, race, and social class that always kind of reflect this core, conservative liberal divide. Hope at least this is where I'm at now. Yeah, Andres.
Thanks, Dave. This is fantastic. And I think I agree intuitively with your framing of 2003 at the beginning of Lula and the framing of the role of state in protecting all these rights. And I'm wondering, and this probably outside the scope of your work, but what are the vehicles, what are the mechanisms that reinforce narratives along these lines.
Yeah.
Certainly, I'm thinking of 2018. I was in Brazil for the Bolsonaro election, and there was very much this reaction of I don't want to be a feminist because I want to have a normal family.
Right.
That was completely weird, but that is sort of very interesting. So to what extent Bolsonaro takes on certain issues, touches on certain key topics to create an anti-Batista.
We have done, we're starting to look at, oh God, I transcribed all of the horario gratuito, the free TV time, presidential campaigns. And so we're plugging that through some LLM, to kind of look at the issues over time. And we did discover that the issues about gender become much more prominent in these online and different across the PT and not PT candidates for president over time. But certain things are more interesting by their absence, like socioeconomic, like policy about taxing and spending, like basic, guns versus butter kind of stuff in U.S. context. And we're going to do that with party platforms and what was the third? So, or the campaign ads, the party platforms, and there was one other thing that we're going to do because that'll give us an over time estimate.
TV or cultural.
Yeah, because we can't do. Someone's going to mention, well, why don't you look at tweets? Or it's like that only goes back to like 2015 or something like that. The internet wasn't. So when I first did the experiment with Cesar, I was very proud in that I did field research by plane, train, ferry boat, subway, bus, taxi, and on foot, like going to all these universities to have a survey implemented in person. Because at the time there was a social network called Orkut in Brazil. The Brazilians here are like, oh yeah, I remember Orkut. And that became gobbled up by Facebook eventually. But that was in the 2010s already. But that's when everybody started noticing like, oh, there's this right-wing, bubble online. But that's already 10 years after the PT had been in power. And so I don't really know in a way, like, how did this all spread online? And people blame Globo and they blame Veja. And maybe traditional media was more important in the 2000s than by the 2010s online. And so it's really tough to blame it all on, oh, well, it's all about Twitter and Bolsonaro tweeting like Trump. That's not possible. We forget, like, these are pretty young. Like Facebook just was on in 2008 in the US when it was getting big. So we're trying, and we have a set of like 300 public opinion surveys that we found that have a party ID question in them going back to the 80s. So at least we can predict what's correlated with machismo. It's really rare, as we found in our book. Surveys don't ask, is there a party you dislike? We found like 6. And so, well, we're asking it. And now you find more surveys asking it, which is kind of nice to see. But you can't go back in time and predict anti-Pechista very easily. So it's a really tough challenge for us. Yeah, well.
Thank you very much for this interesting.
So go ahead.
I've done focus groups and I've done surveys. And the purpose of doing the focus group is basically to get into a conversation with people who you select because of some characteristic in order to then be able to do the best questions for the survey. Because there are many things that are not in your imagination when you try to conduct a survey.
Yeah.
So that's what the focus group is for. So focus groups are, of course, affected by you, the moderator, but the moderator has to know how to pose questions that don't show any bias one way or the other. So you have to have a good moderator for it. But they're also affected by dominant people who are in the focus group. And so they have an overwhelming impact. So sometimes other people become silent. And so you as a moderator have to crowd them out. And so once you have all of that, you can then write the survey. But the survey is key in order to understand whatever you got out of the focus groups. And we can't use a focus group like your set of focus groups in order to produce conclusions that sound like they come from a survey. So what's missing here is, of course, the backup, the survey that comes later, from which you can make a lot of the generalizations that you have been making in the talk, but which are drawn from the focus group thing, which is not the purpose. The purpose of the focus group is to write the survey, and then we need the survey results in order to be able to make a lot of the statements that you have been making.
We did it kind of in an iterated fashion. We did a couple of the surveys, a couple of the focus groups before we fielded the survey. And then we fielded the survey and we said, well, these look similar enough. We're gonna keep going with the focus groups. But I kind of say, well, for us, I don't think the survey and the focus group lose the same result. Something you said kind of had that implication. The survey is very broad but thin, right? But the focus group is narrow but very deep.
The focus groups are able to make the proper question. It doesn't generate the proper results.
So all I can say is we were happy with what we got, with the questions that we were asking. And the reason that we use these questions is because there was 20 or 30 years of people using them in surveys and focus groups, the welfare, the race, and the gender questions. Those were not, we didn't have to tweak those. We wanted to use the same questions that others had been using so that when we send it out for review, we don't get the, well, I don't know about these questions question, because you created these out of what, I don't have any basis for believing these, but they have that external validity of being proven in other peer review research. The welfare deserving these questions, for example, are at least 30 years old. There's 20 or 30 years of work on gender and politics using the benevolent and hostile sexism questions. So I wasn't going to change those fundamentally at all. What we did create at the start, and we did a survey 5 years ago and did this survey, which was questions about status change perceptions. And so we asked, Catholics, women, men, police, military, whatever. We asked some people have gained in society, some people have lost. We played around with that, and that evolved quite a bit. But these batteries, we didn't change much from start to finish, the focus groups. And they were in our survey.
Chairman Adriana, maybe you want to ask sequence and then you take those ones.
Thank you so much. This was super interesting, and I'm still puzzled about the presentation. I think one thing that I was thinking you mentioned a little bit in your presentation is how to detach this from the role of the leader specifically.
Yes.
And how are we going to expect that these partisanships are going to be long lasting? Because if we think about pechismo, a lot of pechistas are more lulistas than pechistas, right?
It's a common question we get, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, do you think that we are still seeing Lula in politics?
I should have put this slide in this presentation. So when Cesar and I published a piece about 10 years ago, and we have a more recent piece where we do the same. And Fernando also had a piece where he shows. So if you ask people, how did we measure? Was it here? Basically, what you do, if you ask people whether they have a party, and they say no, and then you ask them, would you vote for? And they say, well, Bolsonaro, let's just say. And then you array people on a kind of left-right scale, from the most leftist pechista to the most rightist anti-pechista. And so nonpartisans are at 0, let's say, and it goes from 3 to -3. What you find is that Lulistas and Bolsonaristas, Lulistas are like a 1, and average pechistas are like a 2, and Bolsonaristas are like a -1, and anti-pechistas are like a 2. So people who are non-partisans, but who like one of the or the other presidential candidates, are like really weak partisans, i.e. the least polarized of Brazilians. And this is what you'd see in any country. Like the people who have stronger formed ideologies in their brains are going to say, yeah, I like the PT or I hate the PT, right? But if they say, I don't like any parties, I'm non-partisan, but I vote for Lula. Well, no surprise, they might approve of Bolsa Familia or whatever it might be. But they're the people, there's a correlation in any country, and particularly in Brazil, between socioeconomic status and whether you say you're a partisan or not. And there's, as I showed you, there's no correlation between socioeconomic status and whether you're a pechista or not pechista, right? So because you've already weeded out all the poor people, not all, right? right? But a huge chunk of poor people are not partisans. So like 80% of lower class people are not partisans, only 20% are, and it's the reverse among the class A and B, right? Basically what I should keep these in my pocket to show, like, you wouldn't want to look at Lulistas and Bolsonaristas because within that group, it's a much broader set of people from completely not polarized, totally polarized. We want to focus on partisans because we want we want to look at the people with coherent worldviews on both sides. The people in the middle are like, I don't really think about politics too much because they don't pay attention to politics. They're low information voters. So of course they show up in the voter booth, they vote for Lula, and they remember they voted for Lula. That makes some sense.
Thank you.
Who's next?
Sherman, that's the famous last words.
Go ahead.
So let me ask you about question about legacies of structural inequalities, if I understand correctly, that in some of the focus groups, even the concept was brought up. Let me get into the question of legacies. It really refers to a past, something that has lingered over time. I believe they refer to questions of slavery.
Yeah.
One of the outliers, if I understand correctly, Afro-Brazilians.
Say that again.
I'm interested in what I consider might be one of the outliers that you get.
Okay.
You said Afro-Brazilians that are anti-petistas.
Right. They're not unusual though, right? They're from our perspective they are, but in Brazil they're not. Right?
Indeed, but they're outliers in the sense they recognize the structural inequalities, the legacies.
Right.
But do not support the policy.
Right.
Affirmative action. And I think there's a lot there to really dig into.
Me too.
Because then the question is, what is the policy that they embrace? If they recognize
the racism exists.
So and the structural roots going back to slavery. So what's the policy that they would endorse? And if they, so it could be that they recognize the structural inequalities and they decide not to act on them, which is the quintessential question of transitional justice, whether you recognize something or not, and maybe these are people who recognize that, but they don't want to act on. Anyway, just to
so there is this really important literature in Brazilian, mostly historians, sociologists, some quantitative sociologists studying this idea of the racial democracy, that this ideology that was perpetuated that Brazil is a racial democracy. Everybody's equal. There's no Jim Crow. Well, if that were true, Black Brazilians should all believe that racism doesn't exist, right? But we saw that all the Black Brazilians believe racism exists. It's just that there's this divide about, well, what should we do about it? And that's where you're asking me. And I think it's really clear to me that the meritocratic individualism dominates among Black antipetistas. Whatever they think about racism for them is episodic and individualistic. That is, there's always going to be jerks. There's always racists out there. I can't do anything about that. But I can do what I can control is my own destiny. I can bring myself up on my bootstraps. I can overcome this because they're not going to stop me. That's their point. Is that nothing they say or do or try to treat that's not going to stop me. And the Black pechistas are like, they would say all of that, but even if you do that, we still need some help. Because no matter how hard I try, I can't overcome racism on my own. That's the divide between pechistas and Black pechistas and antipechistas, is that the antipechistas are basically libertarians and meritocratic individualists. It's like, I don't need government to help me. I don't want government to help me because it's insulting to me as a person who values my own skills and learning and effort. And I got to respect that in some way, right? And so both sides have this really core, kind of coherent philosophical basis for their beliefs that stretches across the race, the class, and social policies. That's what's consistent across all of this that you see in the surveys and the focus groups. And if it weren't consistent, you would see very different results. Kind of here, in this one. But these are kind of, everybody dreams of results like this, right? Where you don't see any demographic differences across men on questions of gender. That what divides people is partisanship. Same thing about race. Same thing about social class. It's not about social class. It's about partisanship. What's the chicken? What's the egg? Back to Scott's question. I don't know exactly, right? But clearly, once you're in that group, like motivated reasoning is a hell of a drug, right? Partisanship is a hell of a drug, whatever the phrase is that Chris Federico, my colleagues like to lead off every lecture with, essentially. And this is what I teach these days is, polarization in the US is the same as in Brazil. Lucky me, I get to teach about the US and about Brazil. It's all the same. And it's all horrible in a way. It's all not horrible. It's all difficult, right? We all have difficult issues to deal with because, for me, it helps me teach because I recognize what's behind all this is on both sides are coherent worldviews that run into intellectual cul-de-sacs, both sides. Like you teach about Nozick, it's like there's a fundamentally good point under there, but there are structural injustices that a libertarian just says carpet, broom, sweep. Whereas if you talk about Rawls, you're like, all right, so where do you draw the line on who's poor and who deserves that leg up and who decides that? That creates another power that James Madison talked about 250 years ago. How do you control that power? And so libertarians are like, I don't want to deal with any of it. So same in Brazil. That they don't frame these debates like that, but that's what they're talking about. You don't see debates about, Rawls versus Nozick in the, Folha de São Paulo or on Global or whatever like that. Whereas in the US, if you read about polarization, and that's still in there, in chapter 1, right? And so we're trying to bring this discussion to, discussions about Brazil and I would love to see more work about the race and this ideology. Because there's, even if you buy into this, if you not buy into, but if you accept this racial ideology, history of 20th century Brazil, basically, you would not expect to see what we see among Afro-Brazilians, right? This difference between acknowledging racism exists, like Brazil is not a racial democracy, and yet denying that the government should do anything about it on the right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.